Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on the NIH SBIR programs, Developing the Budget. I'm Robert Brook. I'm the Director of Federal Funding Programs here at the Center for Innovative Technology. A quick overview of what CIT does and a little bit about our programs. For those who are in Virginia, you have access to these programs. We are a nonprofit. Mission is to create technology-based economic development strategies to accelerate innovation, imagination, and the next generation of technology and technology companies here across the Commonwealth. As a nonprofit in 1985, we were founded, plugging the gaps at the earliest stages in the innovation continuum, helping entrepreneurs launch and grow high growth technology companies and creating high-paying jobs for the future. Three main programs that support funding initiatives for early stage technology entrepreneurs. Our GAP Seed Fund is an investment fund that provides investment amounts between 50 and 100K of seed funding into early stage high growth potential companies. Obviously, not every company is going to be seeking venture capital, and so those that are seeking it may not be really the high growth potential that venture capital looks for, but we are typically one of the earlier stage investors in a company. If you have interest in learning more about that fund, but part of that fund is actually also the Founders Fund, the Virginia Founders Fund, which focuses on women, minority, and better known companies across the Commonwealth. So let us know about your interest in those programs, and I'm happy to hook you up with the one of the investment directors who manage that program. The Commonwealth Research Commercialization Fund, or CRCF as it's known, is a grant-based fund, so it's the liquidity stays in the company here for the CRCF. Grants between 50 and 100K depending on the program. Typically, the small business grants are $50,000. They are for both private sector and public sector, but we focus here on the SBIR and STTR grant program. There is a special match program for SBIR and STTR grants in certain technology sectors. It's an annual solicitation, typically programs announced in the fall, say November, letter of intent deadline by the end of the year, and then program closes typically January, February, and awards are announced in June. So if you have interest in learning more about that, you can go to our website at CIT.org and you can sign up for the listserv, or let me know and I'm happy to sign you up for their listserv. And then the Federal Funding Assistance Program that I manage provides training like today's webinar. This is part 3 of a 3-part webinar series. We've held a DoD series in the past, Energy, Department of NASA webinars, other specific webinars on many other topics. And so if you have interest in that, you can look at the URL in the next slide here. But we provide this training workshops across the Commonwealth of Virginia. We hire professional outside consultants to give anywhere between half-day and full-day classes on either all agencies or very focused agencies. I engage heavily with our investment team I mentioned to you before. For those who might be, particularly in the NIH or NSF realm, who might be needing to understand their other capital requirements if they're interested in learning more about our investment fund. So you can kind of appropriately discuss that in your proposals at NIH and NSF, which is kind of important to understand how you talk about the other money that's available that you're going to be accessing after the federal money is no longer appropriate. We have a small fund set aside for what we call phase 0 and 00 awards for qualified companies, phase 1 and phase 2 applicants. And this would help you pay for some of the work to hire an outside consultant like today's consultant. There's other consultants we work with as well. So let me know. There's sort of an advance notice requirement on that. We can't do that with a 2-week deadline. We want there to be at least 6 weeks before deadline for us to be able to provide that support and funding. And then, as I mentioned to you, the matching grant program with the CRCF. We do have some other workshops coming up. For those who are listening live, we are recording this and will be available for follow-on viewing. But these are in 2019 workshops coming up in NIH and NSF's workshop April 24th and 25th, both in Falls Church and Charlottesville. And then we have a DoD focused session May 14th and 15th in Norfolk and Fairfax. And then we have a myriad of recordings available for viewing. These are some of the pre-recorded sessions. That URL below is the link to go view all these sessions. We will provide this and the consultant's presentation to everybody via email later today or first thing tomorrow. We'll send those out to everybody. So yeah, but if you have any questions about that, let me know. This is my contact information. Today's webinar will be about an hour long, maybe a few minutes over to allow for any questions and Q&A. If you do have questions, feel free to use the questions box. Don't use the chat box, use the questions box so I can pose that question at the appropriate time and to the instructor today. And if we can't get to your question for some reason, we can follow up later. We'll make everybody here will be sent the email and information from both myself and the instructor. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Shannon here. Let me get your slides up. There we go. Slight delay here. Slideshare from beginning. And so today's instructor is Shannon Bass. She joined BBC ETC as a principal consultant in April of 2018, bringing with her 28 years of management experience in the biotech and biomedical industry. And as an independent SBIR STTR consultant, Shannon's career began with an animal health startup out of the University of Kentucky, which was later purchased by Neogen Corporation. She continued in senior management with Neogen for 17 years in the areas of quality control, assurance, regulatory, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and technical services. She later became CEO of a biotech startup which brought to market a veterinary research device and president of another medical device firm developing a product for treatment of late-stage lung cancer. She has been a principal investigator on multiple research grants, has assisted numerous startups in developing competitive NIH grant submissions, post-award management, commercialization, project management, and building an effective team. She holds a BS degree in animal science from Murray State University in Kentucky. And with that, Shannon, you have control. And again, if anybody has any questions, please send that via the questions box. And so take it away, Shannon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to CIT and to Rob for inviting me to give this webinar. And what we're going to talk about today are budgets, specifically NIH budgets for an SBIR STTR. We're going to go over some budget basics, some different cost types. We're going to talk about project roles within a grant proposal, indirect cost rate, and your budget justification. And then we'll also touch upon subcontract consortium arrangement. So the question is that often people ask and wonder is the budget as important as the technical proposal? And people would say, no, it is not. My opinion is it is very important, although it is not going to be a factor in your review in the sense of it's not going to be a scoring component. They will, the reviewer will look at your budget and decide whether it's appropriate and has enough detail to outline and justify the money that you're asking for. Furthermore, it is going to play a very important role if you are lucky enough to be scored well and be awarded a grant. So there's nothing worse than going through this process, have a great proposal, you get awarded the grant, and then your budget is not put together appropriately, and you determine that you actually do not have enough funds for either the company or your subaward. So it is important to have a well thought out budget during this process. When you start to plan your budget, you need to think about the whole project as a whole. What are your aims going to be? Who's going to be doing that work? How long is it going to take? Obviously, you're going to be thinking about what materials you need. Are you going to need equipment? What collaborators are you going to have on board? Are they going to be consultants? Are you going to have a subaward? And where do you need all this work? Where will all the work be conducted? What will be done at your facility versus a subaward? And so some people wonder, well, what should I do first? Should I work on the budget and then write the research strategy, or write the research strategy and then work on the budget? Well, the first thing you should do, obviously, is work on your specific aims and have a good outline of what your project is. And so once you're ready to start your research strategy, you should be working on the budget at the same time. There's nothing worse than going through the whole process of writing your whole research strategy, then you start to put together the budget and you figure out that you actually don't have enough money to conduct all the work that you proposed in your research strategy. So you should be working on both these components at the same time. So before you begin putting together your budget, you need to understand the roles on the project. What people are going to be senior key personnel? Are you going to have other personnel? Will you have consultants or contract employees? And will you have a subaward? Or would you also potentially, instead of a subaward, could it be a fee for service? Additionally, for your budget, you need to determine what type of limitations and guidelines you have to work under. Be aware of the salary limit. The NIH salary cap right now is $189,600. Be aware of the budget caps for the particular solicitation that you are applying to and the length of the project. There are three parts of the budget that you're going to be putting together. You're going to have direct cost, indirect cost, also known as F&A, and you'll have a fee. And the fee is an additional portion of your budget that is only allowed for an SBIR STTR grant. You also want to be aware of what is an unallowable cost. It's not going to be something you put in your budget, but you need to be aware what is unallowable so you do not put it into your budget. So I'm going to briefly go through all these different components and describe them. Direct cost is exactly what it infers. It's going to be direct costs that's associated with your research proposal, and it's going to be costs that are for the sole purpose of that research proposal. So it will not be direct costs that will also be used for other projects. It's going to be costs just for this particular research proposal. And these type of direct costs will be salaries and wages for any of your senior key personnel and other personnel. You'll need to determine what portion of that salary, depending on the effort they're devoting. Equipment. If it is a phase one, normally we do not recommend that you put in equipment because it does take a lot of your budget up. Equipment is anything that's $5,000 or more. You may have travel. If you do, it needs to be travel that's directly related to conducting the research proposal. Materials and supplies, again, consultants, subaward, and potentially a fee for service. When you're talking about salaries and wages, you need to determine whether they're going to be key personnel or other personnel. Key personnel are going to be people that play a key role on the research proposal. One key personnel is going to be your PI. And so you'll make a determination on your other personnel, whether they're key personnel or other personnel, depending on the type of work they're doing and how involved they are in the scope of the work. Anybody that is a key personnel, you will have to have a biosketch. Other personnel, you will not have a biosketch. So for senior key personnel, like I said, you will have the PDPI is always the senior key person. They're going to be the technical lead. For an SBIR grant, they'll be listed on the company budget side. For an STTR grant, they'll either be listed on the company budget side or the subaward budget. They cannot be on both budgets. Even if it's listed, you list the person at $0, you will only put the PI on one side of this budget. Other personnel, typical other personnel are technicians, examples here, programmers, a data analyst. Administrative personnel are not appropriate to be put in other personnel. That is not appropriate direct cost. They would be somebody that those wages and salaries would be absorbed through an indirect cost. And be aware of the role that you're giving, not only your key personnel, but your other personnel. For example, they're not going to be a graduate student if they're going to be on the company side because the companies do not have graduate students. And also, again, be aware that the personnel do not require a biosketch. And this could be some strategy that you might want to employ. Do you want that person's biosketch? Okay, if you want that person's biosketch, then they're going to be key personnel. You cannot upload a biosketch on other personnel. Equipment will be exceeding $5,000. It's usually based on something that has a shelf life of a year or more. If you should consider potentially leasing equipment versus buying equipment. And also always be aware that the title is owned by the awarding agency. So they always potentially could ask for that equipment. I'm not aware that it ever happens, but it's always a possibility. Again, travel, direct cost that's directly benefiting the project that you're proposing. No foreign travel is allowed. And when you're putting together your travel assumptions, you need to have some details. You need to estimate some cost. If you're going to a conference, what is your estimated airfare, lodging, who's going, how many nights are you staying, and so forth. Your materials or supplies, most commonly people will be budgeting lab supplies, but it needs to be supplies that's going to be directly related to the project. So general supplies, such as these examples I give here, gloves, wires, beakers, that's going to be used in your lab on multiple projects. It's not appropriate to budget here in your direct cost. It would be appropriate to budget those type of supplies in indirect cost. Office supplies is another example that would not be a direct cost material, that would be an indirect cost. Now, some of the roles for consultants versus a contract employee, what's the difference here? Well, a consultant is an individual that you're going to hire to give professional advice from. They're going to be an expert or possess a special skill that the company is lacking. So therefore, they're needing a consultant to add that expertise. You will need to have a biosketch on this person, but they are not an employee, and when you put your budget together, they will not be in that personnel budget line. They will have their own budget line on the grant forms, the budget forms, that's called consultant. And you also are required to submit a letter of support from a consultant. This letter of support needs to be addressed to the PI. It needs to have an outline of the scope of work they're going to be doing, what their rate is, and how many hours that they're committing. A contract employee is just like it sounds. You're contracting somebody to do some work that is not an actual employee. They're not a W-2 employee. Think of it as somebody that you'd be contracting work and filing in the tax year a 1099 on them. Fee for service. This is another direct cost that a company can incur that can go on the company budget side. And so this is for routine services that a lot of companies provide. A good example is a lab that provides toxicology testing. You send them samples, they perform the testing, they will send the results back to you. They're not analyzing the results, they're not making decisions based on those results. They are just providing that service. Another example that potentially could be a fee for service would be animal work. So there are companies out there that will do animal work. If you don't have the animal facilities, they could do this as a fee for service. And again, they are not designing the experiments and interpreting the results. A subaward, also known as a subcontractor, would be an organization that's going to do work at their facility with their personnel. They're going to have their own budget justification. They're not in their budget. They're not going to be allowed to take a fee. That's not allowed. It's only allowed for the small business. And they're going to have indirect rate as part of their budget. For a subaward, eventually you would have to have an agreement between the small business concern and that organization, that research organization. You need to be aware of how this work can be split up depending on whether it was SBIR or STTR. For an SBIR phase 1, 67% of that budget has to be with small business. 33% can be with the subaward. And this is percentages including direct and indirect cost. For a phase 2, that split changes to a 50-50 split that is allowed. For an STTR, both phase 1 and phase 2, the small business concern has to have 40% of the work, and the budget. So I'm talking about work and budget here. And the subaward has to have at least 30%. And so these percentages are the same regardless of whether it's a phase 1 and a phase 2. That additional 30% can go either way. It can go to the small business, or it could go to the subaward, or it could go to a second subaward. The table here that's outlining what I described here for both phase 1 and phase 2 and the differences between an SBIR and STTR that you can refer to later. And just keep in mind this percentage split on what is allowed, the differences between SBIR and STTR. So SBIR, you're allowed to have 33%, but you don't have to have a collaborator at all. You can have the entire budget go to the company for an SBIR. For STTR, you have to have 30% go towards that prime subawarding. So a little bit about indirect costs that's going to be a part of your budget. This is going to be any cost that your company is incurring for the benefit of the whole company. It's not going to be just for the benefit of your particular proposal. So these things could be like, your electric, gas, water, rent. Here's some further descriptions what indirect costs would be. Your fringe benefits, your employer payroll taxes, workers' compensation insurance, paid leave. Those are all fringe benefits that's indirect cost for the company. Other examples would be office supplies, rent, phone, administrative wages, accounting, liability insurance, things like that. Fringe benefits are all going to be, again, paid time off, the company payroll taxes, and then if you offer any type of medical insurance or retirement plan. Unallowable costs. There's more than these three unallowable costs I'm listing here. I'm just listing some examples. One of the most asked questions are patent costs allowable, and they are not. It is not allowable as a direct cost or as an indirect cost. It is an unallowable indirect cost. Same goes for anything that's considered business development, such as advertising and marketing. And here I have a website that you go to that lists all of the unallowable costs. So for your budget, which in the assist forms is called the researcher-related budget, you will need to prepare a detailed budget for every budget period. Okay, and so what I mean by every budget period, if it's a phase 1, it's going to be somewhere between 6 months to 12 months. So you're only going to have one budget period. Budget periods are usually broken up per year. If it's a phase 2, you're going to have 2 budget periods, year 1 and year 2 for your phase 2. If you're doing a fast track, you're going to have 3 budget periods, the budget period for phase 1 and then the 2 years for phase 2. When you put together your budget in the assist forms, you're going to put this detail in for each budget period, and then the system will then calculate a cumulative budget for the whole project. There are some, when you go into these budget forms, and it says there are going to be some components that calculate automatically and some that do not. So you need to be aware of what calculates and what does not calculate, and at times you will have to do that calculation yourself. A good example is that you have to put in the indirect cost calculation and you have to put in the fee calculation. So to recap here on some of the budget types that you're going to have within your budget: your direct cost, your indirect cost, and then your fee. Now for NIH, what's allowed is you're allowed to take up to 40% indirect cost rate without negotiating with the NIH. For a phase 1, you're not allowed to negotiate. You can negotiate and provide, propose a higher rate than 40% in a phase 2, and then you would go into an indirect rate negotiation with the NIH to get that higher rate. However, but you're allowed to take a 40% without going into negotiation. Highly recommend that you take that full 40% rate. What you're going to find is that a lot of people want to have a reduced rate because they're struggling to stay within their budget cap. And so they're thinking to themselves, well, I'm just going to reduce the indirect cost rate. so I can go within, stay within your budget. And I recommend that you don't do that. When you get this grant awarded, whatever budget rate that you propose for your indirect costs, that is what you're stuck with. So if you only ask for 10%, that's all you get. If you determine that you have a higher indirect cost, you can't have more than 10%. However, if you ask for 40% and later you determine that you don't need that full 40%, you can rebudget and put some of that money into direct cost. They don't mind you doing that, but you can't do the reverse. You can't take direct cost and put it into indirect. So asking for the full 40% actually gives you more flexibility, as well as the fee. Always ask for the fee. You're allowed 7% of the total cost, which is total direct and indirect. This is money that has no restrictions. You can do anything that you want with that. So you should always ask for that so you have a flexibility with at least that portion of the budget. You could use that fee for direct cost. You could use it for indirect cost, or you could use it for some of these unallowable costs that you can't spend money on in the other two categories. So for these budget limits, within the guideline, you're going to see that they have a budget limit that they state of $150,000 for phase 1 and $1 million for phase 2. However, you're allowed to take an additional 50% of that. So the hard cap, which they refer to as a hard cap, of phase 1 is $225,000, and for phase 2 is $1.5 million. But additionally, what you need to be aware of is there are several institutes that have special topics that qualify for a waiver where you can exceed that hard cap. And so with each institute, that how high you can go depends. It's different with each institute. Some only allow you to go up to 300,000, some 325. Others will allow you to, for example, go up as high as 450,000. So this is where it's really important to talk to your program director at the institute that where you want your grant to go, and have that conversation with them. Ask them about if your particular proposal will qualify under a budget waiver where you can have more of a budget. And they're going to want to know from you why you need more money, and you need to be prepared to explain why you need more money, whether it's because you're doing animal work and you have to do so many animals that's really driving up the cost is a good example. So highly encourage you to always talk at the beginning of your proposal prep, always talk to your program director, send them the aims, ask to have a phone conversation with them where you're going to talk about whether your aims is appropriate, it's within their mission statement, and then that gives you an opportunity to talk about the budget as well.
Shannon, just a reminder, everybody, that there's a few people that got on the recording presentation here a little bit late. Just to remind you, we will send the PDF versions of these presentations to everybody, so you have this for review, and the recorded link will be sent to everybody as well. In case you missed the morning, some slides, we'll make sure you can have access to the recorded version. So go ahead. I'm sorry. Please.
All right. So, so you're going to start planning your budget. You're going to plan your project. You want to put together a preliminary budget, identify all the resources, and confirm that your project is within the budget guidelines. And so you want to look at your various technical objectives or aims, and determine how long each one is going to take and who's going to do it and where it's going to be done. So some approaches that you can take. You know, you will want to think, once you know what your hard cap is, can the project that you're proposing be done for that amount of money? Again, I want to emphasize here, do not leave out the fee, and always ask for your indirect cost. If you do not need indirect cost, you actually will probably be criticized because all companies have overhead. So if you don't have overhead, are you a real company? So for some of you who joined late, this is the second time I've put this table in because it is a reminder. I want for everybody to remember this restriction that you have to follow on whether it's SBIR or STTR in regards to subcontracting. It is one of the more challenges that I see people have when I work with them on their budget to stay within this particular guideline. So when you're putting together your budget, just think about your task. How many hours is going to be done? Who's going to be doing it? Is it the company or is it subcontract? You know, so you're going to be looking at what's going to be done in-house, what's going to be outsourced, and just come up with this, you know, a quick calculation where you're looking at, for this example, 36,000 and 12,000 that's going to be outsourced, and so that totals 48,000. You take a quick calculation, so you're at 32%. So you're planning SBIR, and so you're under that 33% mark. So these are the type of just rudimentary calculations that you need to do to assure that you're staying within that guideline. Another thing, way to approach this is to work backwards. So if, for example, you know that your budget cap is at 225 and you want to have a 40% indirect rate and you want to take that 7% fee. So what you have to work with on direct cost is roughly $150,000. Okay, and so is all of that $150,000 direct cost going to go towards the company, or is some of that going to go towards the subaward? So even though this 67-33 split that I've been talking about for the subaward versus the small business, the subaward cost still goes within the direct cost budget. A table with another example of the type of splits that you're looking at, whether it's a phase 1 or a phase 2, where with the assumption of the 225K hard cap or the 1.5 mil hard cap, you're looking at a direct cost that's going to be direct cost for the company as well as any subaward. Again, 150K for phase 1, 1 million for phase 2. So it's good to do these type of preliminary calculations. And so if you're working with a subaward, what I would recommend, instead of approaching your research institute, say, I want you to do this, give me a budget, I would instead approach your research institute and say, I want you to do this, here's your budget. You know, you've got 70 grand, what can you do? They might as well know what constraints they have to work within. After you form your budget, you have to write a budget justification. This is a component that's required for your grant submission. It needs to be a standalone document. The reviewer or anybody, for example, like I should be able to look at your budget justification and completely understand how all your money is being spent. So you're going to be writing a description for each line item of money that you're requesting. So you're going to provide a narrative of, here's the people that are going to be my key personnel. They're going to have so many months calendar month effort. This is the salary I'm requesting for them. And you'll detail that. And you're going to detail what they're doing. Not why they're great, not their qualifications. That goes in BioSketch. You're going to be detailing what they're going to be doing, why you need the salary for that person. And the same with providing details on your materials and supplies, fee for service, and so forth. So the things that I want to point out on your budget justification, you know, set this outline up to follow the budget forms that's within Assist, so it's easy to follow. The subaward budget is going to have a separate budget justification, but within your budget justification, you are going to be mentioning them. You're going to say subaward is with University ABC, and you're going to provide a quick blurb about what they're doing and the amount of money for their whole portion. Excuse me. Also, I want to point out that within your budget justification, it's one document. So if you're doing a phase 2, you're detailing the information for both year 1 and year 2 in the same document. If you're doing a fast track, you're detailing phase 1 as well as phase 2, year 1 and year 2. It's all in one document, and you need to split that up. You need to explain how much effort is going into for each key personnel for each year and what that salary is. how much money you're spending on materials in year 1, how much money you're spending on materials in year 2, and so forth. And also in this budget justification, don't forget to leave out an explanation on your indirect cost and the fee. The fee is going to be pretty standard. You're taking 7% of total direct cost, which is such and such amount of money. For your indirect cost, you want to explain what your indirect cost base is. Is it 40% of your total direct cost? If so, you just say that. If it's not 40%, you say whatever rate it is. If it's not total direct cost, if you back something out, you need to explain what you backed out of that total direct cost so they understand what the cost base is. Additionally, if you are going to have a proposal that goes past the hard cap, you need to have a note explaining that your budget is above, for example, this I'm giving here, 225K, and hopefully you spoke to your program director. If you did, give that name and explain briefly why you have to exceed that budget hard cap. Is it because of the additional animal work, like the example I gave earlier, or is it because of something else? So you will just need to provide just a brief explanation regarding that, and then cite the topic that's on their special topics that qualifies for a budget waiver. Provided here just a quick example of what your budget justification is going to look like. So if you looked at this example versus what's on the assist forms, you're going to see that it matches up with how the assist forms are laid out. In the assist forms, you'll see it will be called A, senior key person, B, other personnel, and so forth. And so this is how you want to outline your budget justification. And again, you're talking about, when you're talking about the people, you're talking about what they're going to be doing, how many calendar months, and the total requested salary. The most common mistake I see people make that just refuse to not put it in there is they want to talk about their qualifications. That belongs in the bio sketch. Again, when you're putting together your proposal, keep reminding yourself that you want to be kind to the reviewer. You want the reviewer to read your proposal, so don't repeat things in areas that's not necessary to be repeated. What they're wanting to see here is just your budget and why you need this money. For your subaward, you need to be aware of what you need from the subaward. You're going to need the bio sketches from all key personnel that's on their budget, a budget from them, as well as a budget justification, facilities description, and equipment list. The facilities description is going to be incorporated into your facilities description, so it's going to be one document that you're uploading. And same with the equipment list. It's going to be the equipment list for your company, as well as the equipment list for the subaward. That will be one document. And then you'll need a letter of commitment from them. Now, if it is if you have a subaward, another component that you have to have is called a consortium contractual arrangement. That is a separate component that you'll be uploading into your application. And it's basically just a brief summary of who's doing what in the sense of of the research proposal, what work people are doing. It has here fiscal arrangements. You're not detailing the budget numbers, but you're going to talk about it in just very broad terms. Your company has, say, 60%, 67% of the budget. This particular subaward has this percent of the budget, and I would detail this regarding the aims, where you're kind of calling out that the subaward will be working on aim 1, or they're going to be working on aim 1 and aim 2, and just different portions of it. So you want to make it brief, but it's a good just summary for them to refer to understand, and a quick snapshot of what everybody's doing and how you're going to collaborate. What's your method of collaboration? Now, if it is a STTR, you need to make sure that you include specific language that the research institute will have 30% of the work. And then once you write this component, I would combine this, you're going to start it in Word, and then you're going to put it into a PDF, and I would then at the bottom of this PDF add the letter of commitment from the research institute if it's a STTR. So some details about the language that you want to include regarding STTR here, where you're going to be, again, talking about the 30% work that's performed by the research institute, that you're going to have a cooperative agreement with them, and that letter of commitment is signed by an authorized representative of the research institute. And just some more examples of language that I provided here for you. I don't really need to read this verbatim to you, but you can have this to refer to, where you'll just want to put in language just like this, that's talking about that the small business will have 40% and the research institute will have 30% of the work. I mentioned earlier letter of support. Just want to brief touch upon that again. Your letter of support that you're going to need one from each subawardee. You will need a letter of support from each consultant. Again, the consultant's letter of support needs to detail what kind of work they're going to be doing, their number of hours, and their rate. This is a common mistake that happens a lot, that people will get a letter of support from consultants but not provide that detail. They want to see that detail. Usually a letter of support is just 1 page. Often you can find it'll run into 2 pages. I would not have it any longer than a 2-page letter of support. Try to get it down to one page letter of support. You know, they're verifying their commitment to the project. Have this addressed to the PDPI. Be aware that you're going to have a biographical sketch. What you'll find that, which could be quite helpful for you, is to draft the letter of support and send it to them for them to review and edit and send back to you. This can help you assure that they are including all the components that you need in your letter of support. So to wrap up some budget best practices, develop your budget early. Make sure that your direct costs are consistent with the work that you're proposing. Request indirect cost. Without a doubt, always request your fee. And make sure you understand the difference between what is a direct cost and the indirect cost and a fee. So in conclusion, I just breezed through this presentation. Start early on your budget. Read that solicitation and make sure that you are familiar with all the guidelines and limitations. And not only just for budget, I mean, it's going to state, if you're doing a special solicitation, it will specify what your budget's going to be. So you need to really pay attention to that. If it's a special solicitation, they will outline and may be different than what you're normally used to submitting for just the normal omnibus. So you need to pay attention to that because it will detail what that budget cap is and what that the timeline limitation is as well. So I'm ready for questions.
So again, if there's any questions, please use the questions mechanism in your the GoTo webinar package you have there. Submit that. I'll read that to Shannon. I had a question for those who came on a little late, just to make sure that this is what we talked about today was focused on NIH. But are there any particular? Obviously, there's a commonality with all the agencies, there's slight differences. Are there any particular, gotchas on the budgeting side for NIH compared to other agencies? Is there, to kind of reiterate anything you mentioned that might be specific to the NIH, whether it be the salary limits and that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, you do need to be aware of what the NIH salary caps are, because that is different for NIH as opposed to other agencies. The way you calculate your indirect cost for NIH is different than some of the other agencies. For example, it's different for NSF on how you calculate your indirect cost. So if you're normally been putting together budgets for other agencies as opposed to NIH, there are differences and you just need to be aware of those differences.
And what would be, when you guys are reviewing budgets, the biggest challenge or problem that you always see, or mistakes that people are making that you guys help correct?
One of the biggest challenges that a lot of companies have is getting that appropriate split that I talked about. If it's SBIR, making sure that 67% of that budget is going towards the company. That can be, for a lot of startups, the most difficulty, because they're limited on facilities, and they need other subcontractors to conduct the work. And so if they just can't get that budget to work out, they would have to consider an STTR because of that reason. And that's one of the advantages of an STTR, is that you can swing more money towards a research institute because they have the appropriate facilities. That's one of the biggest challenges I see all the time. The other biggest mistake I see people doing is not taking the full 40% indirect cost rate.
Or the 7% fee, which
or
they
the
allow.
7%, yeah.
Yeah, and as you break out 40% and then 7%, the actual project scope, you know, how much you're getting paid, hourly rates for the company, and especially if you're outsourcing some to a university, with or without an STTR or another product, the scope ends up being relatively small when you think about the amount of hours you can fit into a $100,000 project, less outsourcing. So the budget kind of tells the whole story. A lot of times we've heard that the reviewers, one of the first things they'll look at when they open up a proposal is they go back to the budget and the support letters and look at those things, and they go back and start reading what this project's all about, because they can kind of tell a lot about a project by looking at the budget. So
yeah, just like a company, you can tell a lot about a company if you saw their P&L. And they even though it's not a scoring component, they are going to look at the budget and see if it's appropriate. You know, if you're going to get criticized if you have a budget, if you have work that's under budgeted. They're not going to like that, because you're setting yourself up for failure.
right, they kind of know. They kind of know what efforts, certain kinds of efforts take to be done appropriately, that you're trying to cram more scope into a project that ends up you really can't.
And the other thing I wanted to point out that kind of expands upon your question is cost sharing, okay? So what some people want to try to do for their proposals, they're going to say, well, this portion of the budget for this NIH proposal, this is going to pay for this, but we also have this other money that we're going to use to complete, say, this particular aim. They do not like to see that, okay? Because that's not under NIH's control. And so they want to see a budget that is going to fully fund the work that you're proposing.
So in that realm, you know, don't volunteer to reduce your fee to pay for additional scope until you've actually asked if you can exceed the guidelines. Correct? NIH kind of allows you to, if you really need $300,000 to do this work, talk to them and see if they can allow that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'll talk to them, and it depends on the institute and your research topic on whether you qualify for that budget waiver.
Right, there are some waivers that you can get for that, but obviously doing this in advance is more helpful than a few days before you hit the submit button.
Absolutely.
To have those discussions, they get very
talking to your program director should be one of the first things that you do. As soon as you know what your aims are, you should be firing off those aims to that program director and having a conversation with them.
Right. So this was focused mostly on the basics, the overview, fit more for phase 1 applicants. Are there any big key differences as you move to phase 2? Obviously, the limits, how much you can outsource, and you know, as far as the cost-wise goes up in phase 2 to fit the 50%. Are there any other major differences as you move to phase 2 in the budgeting, or is it?
No, there really isn't, and I'm actually in my presentation I outlined them. The difference is the split on what percentage the company has to have versus what you can contract out, the budget cap, and then your budget justification, where you're going to have more than 1 year and you have to detail that information.
Right. Right.
That's the only differences.
Okay. Questions come through. If you have raised some money from friends and family, I guess more of a dilutive of some level, or friends and family may not be dilutive. How do you treat this in the budget submission? So whether or not, I mean, I'm assuming the money's to the company, not to the project, So question would be is if you have raised some money from friends and family, how do you treat this in the budget submission?
Well, it's not part of it at all,
Right.
because your budget is just talking about spending the money you're getting from NIH to complete this project.
Right. So one of the things, the concept of that fee, you can ask for up to a 7% fee, really at all agencies. Some of them might prefer to be a little bit smaller. However, that money is for you for several things. It's for oh crap, I underestimated how much this particular thing might cost in this particular SBIR, and they're not going to give me any more money. I have to pay for it because I'm not going to. I said I do this. I have to get money from somewhere. I'll take it from my quote unquote fee. 7% of the full top amount. The other side of that is that's money for you to run the other parts of your business, the marketing, the advertising, the sales, the travel outside the scope of the project, the patent filing, the costs, the patent stuff. So the theory would be if you're getting people to invest in your company at some level, that money is not necessarily per project, it's for your company. Now, the good thing about SBIR is that it is non-dilutive. The government owns nothing. Investors typically like SBIR because they're not going to get crammed down in their investment. So there's more money to run the company to do the research as opposed to taking it from my money. My money, the investor's money, can be used for more forward-thinking, other non-allowable costs that the government doesn't allow for. So the fact you're getting positive, encouragement, so to speak, from friends and families or other investors, that money is not to be used as part of the project. The goal of SBIR is to get federal money. The federal agencies are saying we want to fund something that you couldn't really in theory get the money elsewhere to fund. We want to fund specifically for the high risk nature of what SBIR is supposed to be funding. The fact you have other money later, that's great to say, hey, I have this money. I don't know if you put it on your balance sheet. I guess you could. If they ask for your what you have in your bank account, that would be helpful to show that you have money that you can use and you have access to do the follow-on things that you might need to do as far as securing, to do the patent filing and patent protection and travel costs and advertising to help promote your company down the road. So that's a good thing that you're getting other people to provide you money, but it's not specifically for the project that you say, hey, I got money for this project. That's not allowed. I mean, if you're just trying to say you want to get a $500,000 project because we have $150,000 from mom and dad, that's a no-no. To your point, you can't.
What you can do though, if you're wanting to try to tout that you have investors, okay,
Right,
say it's a phase one, the component that's called facilities and other resources. People underutilize that component. You can talk there about your other resources that you have, and you can say you have investors and can talk about that a little bit. So that's where you can try to provide that information for a phase one. For a phase two, you're going to talk about those investors in your commercialization plan.
Right, much more in-depth commercialization plan in phase two. So those are good problems to have if you've got money sitting on the shelf of the company. So congrats to you. And if there's any other questions, we have a couple more minutes to convey those. Otherwise, as I mentioned to you, we will have, I will send the slides out to everybody shortly here after we're done. And then we'll get the recorded version converted and we'll throw up there for follow-on viewing. I'll probably get that URL out to everybody either tomorrow or Monday. Sometimes it takes a day for it to get posted and converted. So, but we'll work on that. And any questions in the meantime, feel free to give me an email or Shannon an email. We want to thank everybody for staying in there with us today. And if there's any other questions, send them through now, or we will go ahead and conclude the webinar just a couple minutes early.
Yeah, and so while we're waiting for any other additional questions, just real quick, what BBC does, we are nationally recognized where we help people obtain federal funding with the SBIR programs. We provide one-on-one client proposal writing and consulting, commercialization planning. We help with your budgets, your submissions, and then we also can help with your post-award grant management, accounting compliance, and quarterly audits.
Yeah, and I know I refer companies to you guys occasionally for help in that budgeting sanity check of sorts. You guys aren't accountants by trade, but certainly do you have a QuickBooks webinar? I think you guys run as well using QuickBooks, I think, and you guys have a lot of support for that as well.
Yeah, we will help people set up their QuickBooks to be compliant, help them adapt policies and procedures to be compliant, help them with all the progress reports that they would have to do with agencies to be compliant. So.
Great. So, so if anybody have any questions, that's fine, and feel free to give us a call and follow up. And we're posting the 3-part series on our website. You can have access to those, and maybe as it comes closer to the April 5th deadline, if you're targeting April for NIH, those might be very helpful. Come a couple 3 weeks ahead of time. And didn't know if there's any other questions you have, any other comments you have about BBC service. I know you have a process to intake companies.
Yeah, that's the slide that I just advanced to. So if you are interested in BBC services, you can go to our website, and there on our website is a link that's called SBIR STTR assessment form. And you can fill out that form, and we would call you, arrange a phone call with you, and we have a complimentary assessment to talk to you about your project, assess whether you are in position to be ready, where you're eligible and also ready to submit to SBIR. You can hear more about our services during that phone call.
Right. The one thing we always say about NIH is if you don't think you've got the best proposal you can possibly prepare, don't submit it. Wait till the next cycle, because the cycle will come through 4-5 months later, and you don't want to. You usually won't be able to resubmit because you won't have heard back yet from the other one. Question came through real quick. How do you handle changing suppliers after you submit the quote? Are there people, expenses, consultants that require approval to change and ones that don't?
The only requirement for NIH is that you have, for prior approval after you get your award, is anything that is listed specifically on your notice of award. So you have to get prior approval about a change in PI, because the PI will always be listed on your notice of award. Sometimes, but very rarely, are other key personnel listed. And if you have a change in your subaward, your research institute, you should get prior approval to that. Normally, you do not have to get prior approval for a change in a consultant, things like that. You will have to get prior approval if you change your budget by more than 25% of the total budget.
And it's also what happens sometimes is when you hit the submit button, and all of a sudden, especially with NIH, you wait and you wait and you wait, right? So it's like 6-9 months later, you might be starting 9 months later, you might be starting the project, which we can always think that maybe you've done some things, maybe you were trying to do some things a month or so before the project was awarded, so you can maybe recover some of pre-award costs. So you can always adjust the scope if you've changed a few things and put the money from one. You don't have to redo it. If you've done it on your own dime, you can get the pre-award costs, or if you can adjust the scope. You're not going to flip the whole project, be a whole other project.
Well, be careful on your term, adjust the scope. If you are changing the scope, the way the guidelines specifically read, if you have a change of scope, you have to get prior approval.
Correct. I mean, as far as so make sure that, if there's anything major that's changed in your project because you've discovered new things, that you want to adjust some things, change a name, those are big. Now, so you can have that discussion with the agency when they're making the award. The question, I think the key is to be upfront in certain circumstances to make sure that you're aware that you don't want to waste money if you've already done it, and you don't want to do it again just to waste money. And I think they'd be happy to know that too. But so just keep that in mind. There's things don't just stop. You don't stop your life waiting for their award. So
and you're allowed to take pre-award cost 90 days from the date of the notice of award. But be aware that if you decided to incur those costs, you don't get reimbursed for that unless you get the award.
Correct. So All right, well, that's it. No other questions have come through. Again, we'll send the presentations out with all of our contact information on there. If there's any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And good luck out there. If you're in Virginia, you want additional support on your proposals, if you're submitting for April, now's the time to ask. The time is getting short. It's only a couple months away now. Actually, less than a couple months. So we're on the clock. So it's like 5 weeks away. Or 1 month away.
1 month.
One month away.
We're less than 4 weeks away.
Yes. So if you're planning and you're targeting the next deadline in September, you could consider coming to our workshop coming up here in April. That might be helpful to you. So any questions? Let us know. Good luck, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.